In September of 1939, the Royal Canadian Navy counted 13 ships in commission and roughly 3,500 men on its books. This is the story of how that Navy grew, in 6 years, into a fleet of somewhere between 370 and 434 warships crewed by 95,000 sailors, and it is also the story of why the famous claim that Canada finished the war with the world's third-largest navy is not quite true, and why Canada's own official sources cannot agree on whether the answer is third or fourth. Start at the end, because the end explains the beginning. On the 16th of April, 1945, 3 weeks before Germany surrendered, the Bangor-class minesweeper HMCS Esquimalt was torpedoed by U-190 off Chebucto Head, a short run from the mouth of Halifax Harbor. 44 of her crew died, and only 27 of the 71 men aboard came home. Esquimalt was the last Royal Canadian Navy warship lost to enemy action in the Second World War, and she went down within sight of home, in Canadian waters, sunk by a submarine operating with something close to impunity at the doorstep of the largest convoy port on the continent, at the end of a war in which Canada had built the third, or possibly fourth, largest navy on Earth. That contradiction sits at the center of everything that follows. Canada produced warship hulls at a rate almost no nation in history has matched against so small an industrial base, and Canada also sent many of those hulls to sea without gyro compasses, without modern radar, and crewed by men who learned their trade in the middle of the North Atlantic, in winter, under fire. The expansion and the crisis were not two separate stories. The one produced the other. Begin with what the Royal Canadian Navy actually amounted to on the 1st of September, 1939. 13 ships sat in commission. 6 of them were river-class destroyers, and their names were HMCS Fraser, HMCS St. Laurent, HMCS Restigouche, HMCS Ottawa, HMCS Saguenay, and HMCS Skeena. Saguenay and Skeena had been built to Canadian specifications, while the other 4 came out of British yards and transferred over from the Royal Navy. Behind those 6 destroyers stood 4 Bassett-class trawler minesweepers launched in 1938, 1 vessel left over from the First World War, and 2 training ships. That accounted for the entire fleet. Personnel figures depend on which definition you accept, and this is the first place in the story where the numbers start moving depending on who does the counting. The Canadian War Museum gives roughly 3,500 officers and men, a figure that folds in all 3 components of the service, meaning the permanent Royal Canadian Navy, the Royal Canadian Naval Reserve, and the Royal Canadian Naval Volunteer Reserve. Count only the permanent force and the number collapses, with one accounting giving 145 officers and 1,674 men, while the Canadian Encyclopedia offers a permanent force of 1,774 with 2,083 reservists standing behind it. Whichever definition you take, the conclusion arrives at the same place. The Royal Canadian Navy of 1939 was smaller than the police force of a mid-sized city, and 4 of its 6 destroyers were sitting on the wrong ocean. 4 of the 6 lay on the west coast when war broke out, which meant they had to steam all the way to Halifax by way of the Panama Canal before they could do anything at all. Canada declared war on the 10th of September, 1939. 6 days later, the first HX convoy sailed from Halifax for Britain, and the Royal Canadian Navy went to war with a fleet that could not have escorted a single one of those convoys across the Atlantic without borrowing help. The reason that fleet was so small has nothing to do with geography and nothing to do with a failure of imagination. It came down to policy. All through the 1930s, the Royal Canadian Navy went hungry, starved of both funding and equipment. In the early years of the Depression, with the government under pressure to cut spending anywhere it could, the service faced the threat of being abolished outright. Not reduced. Deleted. The chief of the naval staff at the time, Commodore Walter Hose, fought simply to keep the service breathing, and the institutional memory of that fight shaped everything that came afterward, because a navy that has recently been threatened with erasure does not develop the habit of asking for expensive equipment. There is a pattern in institutional behavior that anyone who has worked inside a chronically underfunded organization will recognize immediately. When an organization survives a near-death budget experience, it learns to underask, and it learns that the safest request is always the modest one. It optimizes for continued existence rather than for capability. Then the emergency arrives, the money suddenly becomes unlimited, and the organization discovers that it has spent an entire decade training itself not to know what to buy. That describes the Royal Canadian Navy exactly. From 1935, a modest rearmament received approval, and the destroyers Ottawa and Restigouche came across from the Royal Navy, while a training schooner named HMCS Venture was commissioned in 1938. Those were the actions of a service taught to be grateful for scraps. 4 years later, that same service would be asked to build and man hundreds of warships in an ocean war against the most effective submarine force ever assembled. The men running the Royal Canadian Navy in 1939 were not fools. They were the survivors of an institutional famine, and the habits of famine do not evaporate the moment the harvest finally arrives. The naval baseline was small. The industrial baseline was worse. Canada in 1939 possessed, by one count, 3 shipyards employing fewer than 4,000 workers between them, and by another count, 4 operational shipyards with 9 berths as of 1940. The yards that existed sat at Montreal, at St. John, at Victoria, and at Collingwood. That was the sum total of Canada's capacity to build a ship. As for the merchant fleet those yards had produced, at the declaration of war Canada's ocean-going merchant fleet numbered 38 vessels. 38 ships, for a country with the longest coastline in the world, sitting on 2 oceans, whose entire strategic value to the Allied cause would turn out to rest on its ability to move cargo across salt water. Translate that into the language of modern manufacturing and the scale of the problem sharpens. Canada in 1939 was not a shipbuilding nation attempting to scale up. Canada was a nation attempting to create a shipbuilding industry from almost nothing and scale it at the same time, under wartime deadline, while the customer was being shot at. In contemporary terms, that is a company being told to stand up a factory, hire and train the entire workforce, design the production line, and hit full-rate output all at once, with no prototype phase and no tolerance for delay. The learning curve effect in shipbuilding is real, and it can be measured. It is one of the oldest documented phenomena in industrial production, and it holds that the more ships a yard constructs, particularly of a single class, the more efficient the workforce becomes. The principle showed up in New France, where construction costs fell from 277 francs per ton to 177 francs per ton after just 5 vessels. The same principle shows up in Canadian shipbuilding today, where each successive Arctic and offshore patrol ship has arrived with real gains in production efficiency and process maturity. The learning curve is a gift, but the learning curve carries a price, and that price gets paid by the first units off the line. Somebody has to sail the ships built during the learning. Through 1940 and 1941, that somebody was the Royal Canadian Navy. In the fall of 1940, the Canadian government authorized full-scale naval expansion. Corvettes and Bangor-class minesweepers went down on the slipways, merchant shipbuilding began in earnest, and the scale-up was underway. At the center of the entire Canadian naval effort sat one ship, the Flower-class corvette. Canada's initial order in early 1940 called for 64 of them. Across the war, the Royal Canadian Navy would order 70 original Flowers and 34 modified Flowers from Canadian builders, while Canadian yards also turned out 7 originals for the United States Navy and 15 modified Flowers for the Royal Navy. Roughly 122 to 123 corvettes served in Canadian colors. Here is the number that matters most, and it comes from the naval historian Bruce Lecrenne, writing in the Nautical Research Journal. The first 80 or so corvettes each took about 10 months to build, at roughly $600,000 apiece. 10 months, and $600,000. Those are the unit economics of the third-largest navy in the world. The corvette was designed to be cheap and designed to be quick to build, and both of those goals were achieved by making compromises that the men who sailed her would end up paying for. Britain's wartime Prime Minister is said to have called the corvettes the cheap and nasties, a phrase quoted so consistently in the literature that it has become part of the ship's identity, though it is almost always quoted second-hand, and its provenance deserves a degree of caution. The Canadian naval officer Lieutenant W. H. Pugsley, writing in 1945 in his memoir Saints, Devils, and Ordinary Seamen, captured the experience in a single line that outperforms every statistic in the record. Like a policeman on his beat, Pugsley wrote, "The corvette spent monotonous months plodding back and forth across the trackless waste of gray seas that were never at rest." Monotonous months. That was the war, and not the depth charge attack. Now consider the compromises. Canadian yards lacked the technical expertise to produce high-performance marine engines, and so the corvettes were fitted with reciprocating triple-expansion steam engines, which were proven, simple, buildable in Canada, and slow. Maximum speed came out at roughly 16 knots. A Type 7 U-boat running on the surface could make better than 17. Read that again, because it is the most damning specification in the entire Canadian naval program. The primary Canadian anti-submarine escort could not catch the primary German submarine on the surface, which meant the corvette could defend a convoy but frequently could not pursue an attacker. German submarine doctrine in the North Atlantic through 1941 and 1942 was built around exactly that gap, attacking on the surface, at night, and departing on the surface. Canada built 122 of them. The industrial expansion is where the 6 years of the title actually lives, and it deserves stating plainly, because it stands as one of the more extraordinary industrial mobilizations of the 20th century. From 4 operational shipyards in 1940, Canada moved to 6 additional shipyards and a total of 38 berths by 1943. By one accounting, more than 90 facilities were involved at peak, employing over 126,000 people. By a more conservative accounting, by 1945 roughly 57,000 men and women were working in merchant shipbuilding and repair, with tens of thousands more employed on naval work. The yards themselves read like a map of the country. Davy Shipbuilding at Lausanne, Quebec. Canadian Vickers at Montreal. Burrard Dry Dock at Vancouver. Yarrows at Esquimalt. Collingwood Shipyards on Georgian Bay. Port Arthur Shipbuilding. Marine Industries at Sorel. Halifax Shipyards, which took the contract for the Canadian-built Tribal-class destroyers. St. John Dry Dock, which built a corvette named HMCS Sackville that will matter a great deal by the end of this story. Pictou, and Prince Rupert. Merchant output ran to a scale that is hard to absorb. Canadian yards delivered more than 400 merchant ships. The Park Steamship Company, a Crown corporation created on the 8th of April, 1942, ordered roughly 160 bulk cargo ships along with around 20 tankers. The Park ships belonged to the Canadian government, coal-fired, each one named for a Canadian park, while the fort ships were built on British registry, oil-fired, and named for forts, and both types traced back to the British North Sands design. They were Canada's answer to the Liberty ship. Each 10,000-ton vessel carried enough provisions to feed 225,000 people for a week. That is the sentence worth holding on to. Every hull that crossed the Atlantic was a week of food for a city. Many of those corvettes were built in Great Lakes yards, deep inland, at Collingwood and Port Arthur and Midland and Kingston, and this is where the program generated a problem no naval planner had anticipated, one that reads today like a case study in interoperability failure. A corvette could be built on the Great Lakes and sailed down the St. Lawrence to the sea without difficulty. Once the corvette had been fitted out for war service, though, once the armament and the equipment and the additional structure had been bolted on, she could no longer clear the locks on the St. Lawrence River. She could get out. Getting back in was impossible. which meant that ships built in the inland yards could never return to those yards for modernization, and the yard that built her could not upgrade her. The corvette fleet's modernization problem was therefore not simply a question of money or priority. It was a question of physical geometry, because Canada had built a large share of its navy in a place its navy could not return to. The problem ran deep enough that some Great Lakes steel vessels were constructed in halves, floated down through the canals separately, and welded together at Montreal. This is a hardware version of a failure mode that anyone who has ever shipped a product will recognize, which is designing a system that can be manufactured but cannot be serviced. The build path and the maintenance path were not the same path, and nobody discovered that until the ships already existed. Canada's inland yards had, in effect, shipped a product with no upgrade path, and then discovered that the product urgently needed upgrading. The ships were coming off the slipways. Now somebody had to use them. In May of 1941, the Newfoundland Escort Force was established under Commodore Leonard Murray, and that name is worth holding on to, because Commodore Leonard W. Murray ends this story in a way nobody in 1941 could have predicted. The Newfoundland Escort Force existed to plug a hole. Convoys crossing from Halifax and Sydney to Britain needed escorts for the entire passage. There were not enough British escorts to cover it, and Canada would fill the middle. By February of 1942, the Newfoundland Escort Force had been absorbed into a larger structure called the Mid-Ocean Escort Force, whose escort groups carried letters. The A groups were American-led, the B groups were British-led, and the C groups were Canadian-led. The C groups are where this story turns. Across the war, the Royal Canadian Navy escorted more than 25,000 merchant ship crossings, with Veterans Affairs Canada giving the precise figure of 25,343, and roughly 165 million tons of cargo reached the other side. Those numbers form the case for the defense. Whatever else gets said in this story about the quality crisis, about the equipment failures, about the training deficits, the cargo arrived, Britain did not starve, and the invasion of Europe was supplied. The Royal Canadian Navy did the job. What has occupied Canadian naval historians for the past 40 years is the question of how well it did the job, at what cost, and whether that cost was necessary. Here is the mechanism at the center of the entire story, worth stating in plain terms before the evidence arrives. The Royal Canadian Navy scaled its hulls and its crews faster than it could equip and train them. Ships went to sea before they were fully combat effective, and the gap between the number of ships and the capability of ships widened every month. The expansion continued. The expansion itself was consuming the very resources that would have been needed to make the previous month's ships effective, meaning trained men, experienced officers, modern equipment, and work-up time. The Canadian Encyclopedia lays out the causal chain without hedging. The rapid 30-fold expansion, combined with the effort to get large numbers of ships to sea, often before they were fully combat effective, produced an equipment and training crisis in the spring of 1943. Software engineers have a term for this, and the term is technical debt. Technical debt is what accumulates when an organization chooses speed over correctness, when it ships the thing that works well enough today knowing the shortcut will have to be paid for later, with interest. Technical debt is not a mistake. It is a trade, and sometimes it is the correct trade, because a company that refuses to take on any technical debt will be beaten to market by a company that does. Debt compounds, though. The defining property of technical debt is that the interest payments come due at the worst possible moment, which is usually the moment the system comes under maximum load. Between 1940 and 1942, the Royal Canadian Navy took on an enormous quantity of technical debt, and in the circumstances it was a defensible trade, because Britain needed escorts immediately and an imperfect corvette at sea in 1941 was worth more than a perfect corvette in 1944. Canada made that trade knowingly. The interest came due in the winter of 1942. The specifics of the debt run as follows. Early Canadian corvettes put to sea with unreliable magnetic compasses and no gyrocompasses at all, and a magnetic compass in a steel ship, in a convoy, in the North Atlantic, in weather, amounts to an instrument of approximate opinion. Accurate station keeping and accurate attack runs both depend on knowing your heading precisely, and Canadian corvettes frequently did not. Early Canadian corvettes also put to sea with ASTIC, meaning sonar, and without modern Type 271 radar. Well into 1942 and 1943, Royal Canadian Navy escorts were working the North Atlantic run without the centimetric radar their Royal Navy counterparts already carried. The Type 271 was the instrument that allowed an escort to detect a surfaced U-boat at night, and without it an escort was effectively blind against precisely the tactic the German submarine arm had built its doctrine around. Canada could not simply manufacture the missing equipment, either, because Canada depended on British and American supply for gyro compasses, for radar sets, for ASTIC, and for guns. The bottleneck was never Canadian steel or Canadian labor, both of which existed in quantity. The bottleneck was the high-value electronics and precision instruments that Canada did not manufacture and could not obtain in sufficient numbers, because the countries that made them were consuming their own output. Assemble the pieces. A ship that cannot catch a surfaced submarine, cannot reliably see a surfaced submarine at night, and cannot precisely determine its own heading, crewed in many cases by men who had never been to sea before the war, sent out to escort convoys across the most heavily contested stretch of ocean on the planet. The Royal Canadian Navy sent those ships anyway, because it had no other option that anyone in 1941 could see. On the night of the 11th and 12th of May, 1942, the German submarine U-553, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Karl Thurman, torpedoed two merchant ships off the Gaspé Peninsula. The ships were the SS Nicoya and the SS Leto, and 18 men died with them. The Battle of the St. Lawrence had begun, and with it came something that had not occurred in Canada since the War of 1812, because a foreign power was now inflicting casualties inside Canada's inland waters. Between 1942 and 1944, roughly 16 to 17 U-boats operated in the Gulf and River of St. Lawrence, sinking somewhere between 23 and 26 ships. Among the dead were Canadian warships, including the armed yacht HMCS Raccoon, the corvette HMCS Charlottetown, and the corvette HMCS Shawinigan. On the 14th of October, 1942, the Newfoundland Railway ferry SS Caribou was crossing the Cabot Strait when U-69, under Captain Lieutenant Ulrich Graf, put a torpedo into her. Of the 237 people aboard, 136 or 137 died, and many of them were women and children. Nursing Sister Margaret Brooke received the MBE for her conduct that night. The Caribou was a ferry. She was carrying civilians between Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. She was sunk in Canadian home waters, in a strait Canadians crossed as ordinary domestic travel, and she remains the deadliest single event of the entire Battle of the St. Lawrence. The military consequence landed hard. On the 9th of September, 1942, the federal government closed the St. Lawrence to all overseas shipping, which shut the Great River, the artery connecting the industrial heart of Canada to the Atlantic. War material had to be rerouted through American ports, and the closure held into 1944. The domestic consequence was a shock that wartime censorship could suppress but could not erase. A nation that had understood the war as something happening across an ocean discovered that the ocean had arrived, and the government's decision to close the Gulf amounted to an admission that the Royal Canadian Navy could not guarantee the security of Canada's own front door. There is one detail here that reads like fiction and is not. On the 9th of November, 1942, U-518 landed a German agent named Werner Janowski at New Carlisle, Quebec, and he was caught almost immediately. The submarine that put him ashore left unmolested. Now the debt comes due. The historian Mark Milner, whose 1985 book North Atlantic Run remains the foundational scholarly treatment of the Royal Canadian Navy's escort war, states the position without softening a word of it. Through the winter of 1942, Canadian escorted convoys were attacked by German wolf packs more often than convoys escorted by other Allied navies, and in Milner's own framing there can be no doubt that the losses sustained by the Canadian groups ran comparatively higher. Two convoys define the disaster. Convoy SC-107, in November of 1942, lost 15 ships while the naval escort sank no U-boats at all, and Mark Milner describes the outcome as a devastating blow to Canadian prestige and morale. Convoy ONS-154, at the end of December 1942, went worse still, and Milner calls it an unmitigated disaster, the last in a long string of defeats. Here is the number that Mark Milner surfaced, the number Canadian naval mythology spent 35 years declining to discuss. On the 4th of March, 1943, the corvettes HMCS Shediac and HMCS St. Croix sank the German submarine U-87. That kill, U-87 in March of 1943, was the only wholly Royal Canadian Navy U-boat kill in that phase of the war. One submarine. In a fleet that by then numbered hundreds of hulls, escorting the most contested convoy route on Earth, at the climax of the Battle of the Atlantic, the Royal Canadian Navy achieved exactly one unshared submarine kill in that phase. That is what the technical debt bought. Ships that could not catch, could not see, and could not kill. By the end of 1942, the British had reached a conclusion about the Royal Canadian Navy that no Canadian wanted to hear. The Canadian War Museum states it directly, that by the end of 1942 the British felt Canadian escort groups were no longer able to handle duties in the heavily embattled mid-ocean. In early 1943, Britain pulled Canada's battered mid-ocean escort groups off the North Atlantic run and moved them to British waters, partly to free crack British support groups for the main battle, and partly to allow the Royal Canadian Navy to re-equip with the radar and weapons the British already had. Understand exactly what that was. This was not a redeployment. This was the Royal Navy telling the Royal Canadian Navy that its ships were not good enough for the main fight, and removing them from it. It stands as the most humiliating episode in the history of the Canadian Naval Service, and it happened at the precise moment when Canada's shipyards were producing hulls faster than at any point in the nation's history. The fleet had never been larger, and the fleet was also, by the judgment of Canada's principal ally, not fit for the mid-ocean. The Canadian groups did not even get a rest out of it. Pulled from the mid-ocean, they were put onto the United Kingdom to Gibraltar Run, where they were heavily engaged. The Royal Canadian Navy was removed from the main battle for being insufficiently capable, and then worked hard somewhere else. Now comes the part that most treatments of this story get wrong in one direction or the other. The standard popular account of the Royal Canadian Navy's war, running from Joseph Shull's official narrative The Far Distant Ships in 1950 through decades of commemorative writing, is celebratory, all brave Canadians and gallant corvettes in the North Atlantic won. The standard revisionist account, established by Mark Milner in 1985, is damning, with its undertrained crews and obsolete equipment and comparatively higher losses and that single unshared kill. Both accounts are supported by evidence, neither is complete, and there exists a third scholarly position that deserves far more airtime than it gets. The historian Robert C. Fisher, writing in Canadian Military History in a study titled The RCN's Summer of Success, July to September 1942, argues that the picture of Canadian incompetence does not survive contact with the actual record. Fisher's evidence is specific. During the summer of 1942, the period supposedly defined by Canadian failure, Royal Canadian Navy escorts sank U-90, destroyed by HMCS St. Croix. They sank U-558, destroyed by HMCS Skeena working with HMCS Wetaskiwin. They sank U-210, destroyed by HMCS Assiniboine. Robert Fisher's argument is that the poor overall Canadian record reflected two things having nothing to do with the competence of Canadian sailors. The first was bad luck in convoy assignment, because the Canadian groups drew the more heavily attacked convoys, and if you are escorting the convoys the wolf packs choose to attack, your loss statistics will look worse than those of a group covering quieter routes no matter how good your sailors are. The second was equipment, because the C groups were fighting the same enemy as the B groups with materially inferior instruments. Here is the reframe, and it is the argument this story makes. The Royal Canadian Navy's crisis of 1942 was not a failure of Canadian seamanship. It was a failure of Canadian procurement, and it followed directly, predictably, and almost mathematically from the very expansion Canadians celebrate. You cannot have both. Nobody builds the third-largest navy in the world in 6 years, starting from 4 shipyards and 3,500 men, and also fields a navy that is uniformly well-equipped and well-trained in 1942. The hulls and the capability were competing for the same scarce resources, meaning skilled men, experienced officers, radar sets, gyro compasses, and work-up time. Every additional corvette commission made the average Canadian escort less experienced, because the experienced men had to be spread thinner to crew it. The famous achievement and the famous humiliation are the same policy, viewed from 2 different angles. This is the hypergrowth problem, and it explains why every startup that has ever scaled from 20 people to 2,000 in 18 months tells the same story afterward. Headcount grows faster than culture, faster than training, faster than tooling, average tenure collapses, and the people who know how things work get consumed by onboarding the people who do not. Quality metrics degrade, and not because anyone got worse, but because the denominator exploded. Move fast and break things is a strategy with a bill attached. The Royal Canadian Navy moved fast, the things that broke were ships, and the bill was paid in men. One officer saw the problem early and did something about it. Commander James D. Prentice, known throughout the service as Chummy, of the Royal Canadian Naval Reserve, served as senior officer Canadian corvettes and functioned as the service's training pioneer. Against the emerging consensus that the corvette was simply an inadequate platform, Prentice held that the corvette was an excellent anti-submarine vessel, nimble and capable, provided the crew knew how to fight her. Chummy Prentice drilled what he called the quick attack, meaning the fast, aggressive response to a contact, executed before the submarine could react. Mark Milner's critique and Chummy Prentice's advocacy are not actually in conflict, because both men are describing the same fact from opposite ends. Prentice was proving that the corvette worked when the crew had been trained, and Milner was demonstrating that most crews had not been. The corvette was not the problem. The corvette in the hands of a crew assembled 6 weeks ago, aboard a ship with no radar, was the problem. Somebody was going to be held responsible. Vice Admiral Percy W. Nels had served as Chief of the Naval Staff since the 1st of January, 1934. Nels presided over the entire expansion, took a service of 13 ships and turned it into a fleet of hundreds, and by any conventional measure Percy Nels was the architect of the achievement this whole story is named after. In 1943, the criticism surfaced. A publisher and reserve officer named Andrew Dias MacLean publicly attacked Royal Canadian Navy leadership, which prompted questions in Parliament, and behind that public attack came a wave of confidential in-service criticism, much of it from reserve officers, the men actually sailing the corvettes, focused precisely on the issues this story has been laying out, meaning the corvette fleet's outdated equipment and its inadequate training. The charge against Percy Nels was specific and it was serious. Nels was alleged to have withheld information about equipment deficiencies, particularly the slow pace of radar and ASTIC modernization, from the Minister of National Defense for Naval Services. Not that he had failed to fix the problem, but that he had not told the minister the problem existed. The minister lost confidence in him. On the 15th of January, 1944, Percy Nels ceased to be Chief of the Naval Staff, and Vice Admiral George C. Jones replaced him. Nels was not fired outright. Instead he went to London as Senior Canadian Flag Officer Overseas, a largely administrative post coordinating Royal Canadian Navy operations for the invasion of Europe, and he retired in January of 1945 holding the full rank of admiral. Percy Nels died on the 13th of July, 1951. Historians still argue about whether any of that was justice. The case against Percy Nels runs like this. He ran the service's equipment was inadequate, and he did not tell the government how inadequate it was. The case for Nels runs like this. He was handed an impossible task, he executed the expansion the government demanded, the equipment bottleneck sat in British and American factories rather than in his office, and he was removed at the precise moment the modernization program he had been running was about to bear fruit. Percy Nels built the third-largest navy in the world, and Percy Nels was removed from command of it for building it too fast. Both of those statements are true, and that is the problem. The Royal Canadian Navy that came out of the crisis of early 1943 was a different service. Between the 1st and the 12th of March, 1943, the Atlantic Convoy Conference met to reorganize the entire Allied escort effort, and out of that conference came a decision with no precedent in Canadian military history. On the 1st of April, 1943, Rear Admiral Leonard W. Murray became Commander-in-Chief, Canadian Northwest Atlantic. Leonard Murray thereby became the only Canadian to command an Allied theater of operations in the Second World War. Not a Canadian formation inside an Allied theater, but a theater. The Canadian Northwest Atlantic was Canada's ocean, run by a Canadian admiral, out of Halifax, and that remains the high-water mark of Canadian naval independence, never reached again since. Murray described his own method in a passage that tells you more about the Battle of the Atlantic than any casualty table. To encourage the captains of the merchant ships of all countries carrying the lifeblood of the United Kingdom, Leonard Murray made a point of attending the briefing conference of every captain and chief engineer before departure. Murray was also clear-eyed about what he was sending them into, because during the winter of 1942 and 1943, when the sinkings ran at their worst, he understood that anything up to 25% of the men he was briefing would probably not arrive in the United Kingdom in their own ships. 1 in 4. Leonard Murray looked at those men, and briefed them, and knew. In May of 1943, Admiral Karl Donitz withdrew the U-boats from the central North Atlantic, and the convoy battle had been lost by Germany. What happened next is the part Canadians should be told more often, because with the modernized equipment finally arriving and the training finally embedded, the Royal Canadian Navy started killing submarines. The year 1944 turned into the Royal Canadian Navy's best anti-submarine year of the war. On the 27th of February, 1944, the frigate HMCS Waskesiu destroyed U-257, and between that kill and the end of April, the Royal Canadian Navy sank 4 of the 14 U-boats claimed by Allied surface vessels across the entire North Atlantic. 4 out of 14, from a service that 12 months earlier had managed a single unshared kill in a year. The debt had been paid, the interest had been brutal, but the Royal Canadian Navy that fought in 1944 was, by the numbers, a genuinely effective anti-submarine force. The reason it became effective in 1944 is that it had been forced to stop, re-equip, and retrain in 1943, which means the withdrawal that humiliated the Royal Canadian Navy is the same event that made the Royal Canadian Navy good. That is what paying down technical debt actually looks like. It is not glamorous, it looks like failure, it looks like being pulled off the main project and sent to do maintenance while other teams collect the credit, and it is the only thing that works. An organization that never stops to refactor never gets faster, it simply accumulates until it fails catastrophically. The Royal Canadian Navy refactored in 1943, and that is why it functioned in 1944. On the 6th of June, 1944, the Royal Canadian Navy went to Normandy. Roughly 110 Royal Canadian Navy ships and over 10,000 Canadian sailors took part in Operation Neptune, the naval component of the invasion, and the composition of that force tells you what the service had become. 15 destroyers, 11 frigates, 19 corvettes, 16 minesweepers, 15 motor torpedo boats, 2 landing ships, plus landing craft flotillas and a beach commando unit. Royal Canadian Navy Bangor-class minesweepers of the 31st and 32nd Flotillas cleared the lanes to the beaches, which was the least celebrated and most necessary job of the entire operation, performed in darkness, ahead of everything else, by ships built in Canadian yards to sweep mines, and spent the war doing exactly that. The destroyers HMCS Algonquin and HMCS Sioux delivered gunfire support at Juno Beach, where the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division landed. The corvettes that had been dismissed as cheap and nasty in 1940 were at Normandy in 1944. The Royal Canadian Navy paid for the expansion in a currency no shipyard could produce. Casualty figures depend on definitions, and this account gives the definitions rather than pretending to a precision that does not exist. Deaths ran to approximately 2,000, using the round figure from Veterans Affairs Canada. The fullest official count, from the Government of Canada, gives 2,210, including 6 women of the Women's Royal Canadian Naval Service, while intermediate precise counts of 2,024 and 1,990 also appear in the record. Ships lost run to approximately 22 principal warships, if the definition stays restricted to fighting ships, meaning 14 lost to enemy action and 8 to accident or collision. The count rises to approximately 24 once armed yachts and auxiliaries are folded in, and to 31 or 33 once every motor torpedo boat, landing craft, and minor auxiliary gets counted. All 3 of those numbers are correct, because they are answers to 3 different questions. Name them. HMCS Fraser, on the 25th of June, 1940, rammed by the British cruiser HMS Calcutta in the Gironda estuary during Operation Ariel, roughly 47 Canadian dead. She was the first Royal Canadian Navy warship lost in the war, and she was lost not to the enemy but to a collision with an ally in the dark. HMCS Marguerite, on the 22nd of October, 1940, in collision with the freighter Port Ferry in the North Atlantic during convoy OL-8, 142 dead. Here is the detail that makes Marguerite unbearable, because many of the men who died aboard her were survivors of HMCS Fraser who had transferred to Marguerite after their first ship went down 4 months earlier. They survived 1 collision, and they did not survive the second. HMCS Otter, on the 26th of March, 1941, lost to an accidental engine room fire and explosion off Halifax, 19 dead, no enemy involved. HMCS Windflower, on the 7th of December, 1941, in collision with the SS Zypenberg in fog on the Grand Banks during convoy SC-58, 23 dead. She was the only Royal Canadian Navy corvette lost to marine accident. HMCS Spikenard, on the 10th of February, 1942, torpedoed by U-136 in the mid-Atlantic during convoy SC-67, 57 dead and only 8 survivors, with the senior officer of the escort group going down alongside his ship. HMCS Charlottetown, on the 11th of September, 1942, torpedoed by U-517 in the St. Lawrence off Cap Chat, 9 or 10 dead. HMCS Ottawa, on the 13th or 14th of September, 1942, because the sources differ, torpedoed by U-91 during convoy ON-127, roughly 114 dead, with some accounts giving 141. HMCS Louisburg, on the 6th of February, 1943, and this one is almost always reported wrongly. Louisburg was not sunk by a submarine. Louisburg was sunk in the Mediterranean during the Operation Torch convoy KMF-8, by Italian aircraft, using bombs and an aerial torpedo, and 38 to 40 men died. HMCS Athabascan, on the 29th of April, 1944, and this one was not a submarine either. Athabascan was torpedoed in the English Channel by the German torpedo boat T-24, and 128 men died, which is the single greatest loss of life from any Canadian ship in the Second World War. 44 men were pulled from the water by HMCS Haida, and 83 were taken prisoner. HMCS Valleyfield, on the 7th of May, 1944, torpedoed by U-548 with an acoustic torpedo off Cape Race, 125 dead, and she was the only Royal Canadian Navy River-class frigate lost in the war. HMCS Shawinigan, on the 24th or 25th of November, 1944, because she went down around 2:30 in the morning on the 25th, torpedoed by U-1228 with an acoustic torpedo in the Cabot Strait, lost with all 91 hands and not a single survivor. Nobody knew what had happened to Shawinigan until U-1228 surrendered at the end of the war, and she stands as the greatest single loss of the Battle of the St. Lawrence. HMCS Clayoquot, on the 24th of December, 1944, on Christmas Eve, torpedoed by U-806 off Halifax, 8 dead. HMCS Guysborough, on the 17th of March, 1945, torpedoed by U-878, roughly 51 dead, and she was the last Royal Canadian Navy ship lost overseas. HMCS Esquimalt, on the 16th of April, 1945, torpedoed by U-190 off Chebucto Head near Halifax, 44 dead, with only 27 of 71 men surviving, and she was the last Royal Canadian Navy warship lost to enemy action in the Second World War. Look at that list again and notice what it says about the expansion. Fraser went to collision. Marguerite went to collision. Otter went to accident. Windflower went to collision. Of the roughly 22 principal warships Canada lost, 8 were lost to accident or collision, which is well over a third of them. Ships crewed by men who had never been to sea before the war, keeping station in convoy at night, in fog and weather, without gyro compasses, ran into things. The expansion killed Canadian sailors before the Germans ever got a shot at them, and that too is part of what the third-largest navy in the world cost. There is a second Canadian Navy in this story, and Canada spent 50 years refusing to admit that it existed. Roughly 12,000 people served in the Canadian Merchant Navy, and approximately 1,451 of them died aboard Canadian-flagged ships, a figure that comes from the Juno Beach Center. Run the arithmetic. Roughly 1 in 10, which is a proportional death rate higher than the Royal Canadian Navy's own. The Canadian Merchant Navy sailed the Park ships and the Fort ships, sailed unarmed or barely armed, in convoy, at the speed of the slowest vessel, carrying ammunition and fuel and food across an ocean full of submarines. When the corvettes were escorting 25,000 merchant ship crossings, those crossings were these men. The Merchant Navy was the cargo, and the Merchant Navy was the point. When the war ended, Canadian merchant mariners were told they were not veterans. They were denied veterans' benefits for decades, and decades is the accurate word rather than years. Official veteran status did not arrive until 1992, which is 47 years after the war ended, and benefits and pensions were not made retroactive until the year 2000. In 1998, 4 Merchant Navy veterans staged a hunger strike on Parliament Hill. Men in their 70s and 80s, who had crossed the North Atlantic in ships that burned, refused food in Ottawa in order to be recognized by the country they had fed. In 2003, Parliament declared the 3rd of September to be Merchant Navy Veterans Day. The Merchant Navy veteran Ossie McLean put the whole case into 7 words, saying that they were the men who saved the world. He was right, and he had to watch his shipmates starve themselves on a lawn in Ottawa before anyone in authority would say so. Now settle the question in the title, which cannot be settled, and the reason it cannot be settled is the most interesting thing about it. The claim holds that by 1945 the Royal Canadian Navy ranked as the 3rd-largest navy in the world, behind only the United States Navy and the Royal Navy, and that claim appears in essentially every Canadian institutional source. Mark Milner endorses it, writing that the wartime expansion produced the 3rd-largest navy in the world by 1945. The Canadian Encyclopedia says 3rd. The Canadian War Museum says 3rd. Defining Moments Canada says 3rd. Then there is the other camp. Encyclopaedia Britannica describes the Royal Canadian Navy as the fourth-largest fleet in the world, behind the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, with more than 400 warships. The official Government of Canada Battle of the Atlantic commemoration also says fourth. Read that again. The Government of Canada's own official commemoration of the Battle of the Atlantic does not agree with the Canadian Encyclopedia, the Canadian War Museum, and Canada's foremost naval historian about where Canada's Navy ranked in 1945. This is not a footnote. This is the central claim of the Canadian naval legend, unresolved inside Canada's own official sources. The disagreement exists because largest navy is not a defined term, and every source is quietly using a different definition. Count warship hulls in commission in 1945 and Canada looks enormous. Veterans Affairs Canada gives 373 fighting ships. Britannica gives over 400 warships. Veterans Affairs Canada elsewhere gives 434 commissioned vessels. The Canadian Encyclopedia, citing the official history of Blue Water Navy by Douglas and Whitby, gives 471 warships and auxiliary vessels. Notice what just happened there. 373, then 400, then 434, then 471. For different answers to the question of how big the Royal Canadian Navy was in 1945, every one of them sourced, every one of them defensible, and the spread between the smallest and the largest runs to 98 ships, which is itself a considerable navy. The gaps are definitional. Does an auxiliary count? Does a motor launch count? Does a landing craft count? Does a vessel count if it has been commissioned but is not operational? Then there is the number that gets abused. The figure of over 1,140 vessels appears in reference works, and it is technically accurate as the cumulative wartime total of every commissioned, non-commissioned, loaned, hired and auxiliary craft that passed through Royal Canadian Navy hands across the whole war. It is not a snapshot of 1945. Anyone using 1,140 as the size of the fleet in 1945 is inflating the Royal Canadian Navy by a factor of nearly 3. Hull count, though, is the friendly metric. Now apply the metrics navies are actually measured by. The Royal Canadian Navy of 1945 had no battleships, and no capital ships of any kind. The Royal Canadian Navy of 1945 had no fleet carriers of its own. It operated 2 escort carriers, Nabob and Puncher, and the record here needs correcting, because it is routinely reported wrongly. Nabob and Puncher were owned by the Royal Navy, transferred under Lend-Lease, and commissioned into the Royal Navy. Royal Canadian Navy crews manned them predominantly, but their flight crews came from the Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm, and they flew the white ensign of the Royal Navy. Writing HMCS Nabob is technically incorrect. Canada crewed them chiefly to build the institutional knowledge base for the carriers it intended to operate after the war, and Nabob was torpedoed by U-354 on the 22nd of August, 1944, with 21 dead, and never repaired. The Royal Canadian Navy of 1945 had no submarines of its own, ending the war in possession of 2 ex-German U-boats taken as prizes. Canada's cruisers arrived essentially after the fighting was over. HMCS Uganda transferred on the 21st of October, 1944, on Trafalgar Day, at Charleston, and served in the Pacific through 1945. HMCS Ontario was commissioned on the 25th of May, 1945, at Belfast, which is 17 days after Germany surrendered. Both were, in substance, transfers from Britain. The Canadian-built Tribal-class destroyers, the ships that were supposed to be Canada's own fleet destroyers, built in Canadian yards at Halifax, arrived too late for the war entirely. HMCS Micmac came first and was not combat-ready until September of 1945, while Micmac, Nootka, Cayuga, and the second HMCS Athabascan all missed the fighting. The tribals that actually fought, meaning Iroquois, Athabascan, Haida, and Huron, were British-built. So here is the honest answer to the question in the title. By 1945, the Royal Canadian Navy had grown to roughly 370 to 434 warships and about 95,000 personnel, which made it one of the largest navies on Earth. It is commonly called the third largest, and some authorities, including the Government of Canada, rank it fourth, behind the Soviet Union. It was also, almost in its entirety, a small ship anti-submarine escort fleet, made of corvettes and frigates and minesweepers, with no battleships, no carriers of its own, and no submarines. It could not have fought a fleet action, and it was never built to. It was built to do one thing, which was to get merchant ships across the North Atlantic, and by any honest measure it had become, by 1944, extremely good at that one thing. The Royal Canadian Navy was not the third largest navy in the world in the sense that phrase implies. The Royal Canadian Navy was the largest escort fleet in the world, and it deserves to be described accurately rather than flattered inaccurately. The war in Europe ended on the 8th of May, 1945. Halifax had served as the pivot of the entire Canadian war effort, taking every convoy, every escort group, every sailor. The city's population had been swamped for 6 years, housing was impossible, prices were extortionate, and the relationship between the city of Halifax and the Royal Canadian Navy had curdled into open mutual contempt. On the 7th and 8th of May, 1945, roughly 9,000 to 9,500 sailors were given shore leave into a city where the restaurants were closed, the theaters were closed, and the liquor stores were closed. 2 days of rioting and looting followed. 3 people died, 2 of them from alcohol poisoning. Roughly 363 people were arrested, 564 businesses were damaged, 207 of them were looted, and approximately 2,624 windows were smashed. Damage estimates ran to over $1 million in contemporary terms, with some reaching $5 million. The Royal Canadian Navy celebrated the end of the Battle of the Atlantic by wrecking the city that had hosted it. The Kellock Royal Commission was appointed on the 10th of May, 1945, and reported on the 28th of July. Kellock blamed the Navy, and specifically blamed Rear Admiral Leonard W. Murray, the man who had commanded the Canadian Northwest Atlantic, the only Canadian ever to command an Allied theater, for insufficient control of his men. Leonard Murray was removed from command on the 12th of May, 1945, 4 days after VE Day. A separate Naval Board of Inquiry, conducted under Rear Admiral V. G. Brodeur, reached more balanced findings. Murray blamed the civil authorities of Halifax, and his position, in his own words, was that though service personnel were present throughout the afternoon, in almost all cases civilians led the assault and encouraged service personnel to take part. Leonard Murray requested a court-martial so that he could clear his name, and the request was refused, which denied him the trial that would have let him defend himself. Murray resigned in September of 1945, never held another command, emigrated to England, and became a lawyer. Historians do not agree about Leonard Murray, and this account will not pretend otherwise. One reading, stated bluntly in the popular literature, holds that the riots were and will always remain his responsibility, because he commanded those men, the men rioted, and command responsibility is not a negotiable concept. The Canadian Encyclopedia takes a different view, locating the causes in bureaucratic confusion, insufficient policing, and antipathy between military and civilians, which makes it a systemic failure rather than a personal one. What nobody disputes is the shape of the thing. The Royal Canadian Navy's 2 most senior figures of the war both finished it in disgrace. Vice Admiral Percy Nels was removed in January of 1944 for the equipment crisis the expansion had caused, and Rear Admiral Leonard Murray was removed in May of 1945 for a riot committed by sailors who had spent 6 years in a city that resented them. Neither man was permitted to defend himself publicly, and neither man ever commanded again. The navy they built was the 3rd largest in the world. Canada built the third-largest navy in the world in 6 years, and then Canada dismantled it in roughly 18 months. At the wartime peak, the Royal Canadian Navy carried over 93,000 personnel. By April of 1946, fewer than 6,500 remained, and by 1949, according to the Mengay report, the service had settled at roughly 8,800. 95,000 down to 6,500 is not a drawdown. That is an evaporation. The corvettes went with them. Most of the Flower-class corvettes were scrapped soon after the war, some were sold to foreign navies, and the name Louisburg was carried on by a ship sold to the Dominican Republic that was ultimately wrecked by Hurricane David in 1979. Others were converted for merchant use or for whaling. Ships that had escorted 25,000 merchant crossings were sold off for scrap and for whale oil. Then, in the spring of 1949, the Royal Canadian Navy mutinied. 3 times. On the 26th of February, 1949, aboard HMCS Athabascan. On the 15th of March, aboard HMCS Crescent. On the 20th of March, aboard HMCS Magnificent. In each case, the ship's company locked themselves into their mess decks and refused to work. The government appointed a commission under Rear Admiral Rollo Mengay, who had been the first commanding officer of HMCS Uganda, and the Mengay report of November 1949 dismissed the fears of communist infiltration and collusion that had been raised immediately. Mengay blamed poor officer-to-man relations, service conditions, and, in the phrase that matters most, the stresses of rapid expansion and contraction. The expansion broke the Navy, and then the contraction broke it again. The historian Richard Gimblett has argued for a different reading of 1949, and it deserves serious consideration. Gimblett's position holds that the so-called mutinies were not an aberration at all, and that the mess deck lock-in was a long-standing, almost traditional form of protest inside the Royal Canadian Navy, with a lineage reaching back into the 1930s. The Mengay report, in Gimblett's account, obscured that wider pattern by treating 1949 as a crisis of the post-war moment, while the immediate trigger in 1949 was mundane, being a rank reorganization that left ships with too many chiefs and not enough seamen. The organizational literature has a name for what happened to the Royal Canadian Navy between 1939 and 1949, and the name is not victory. It is a hypergrowth and crash cycle. An organization scales 30-fold in 6 years, hires and promotes far beyond its ability to enculturate anyone, achieves the mission, and then contracts by 93% inside 18 months, at which point the people left behind discover that the institution no longer knows what it is, because everyone who could have told them has gone home. The Royal Canadian Navy of 1949 had done something extraordinary and no longer knew how to be itself. The lock-ins were the symptom. Of the roughly 269 to 294 Flower-class corvettes built anywhere in the world, exactly one is still afloat. HMCS Sackville was laid down in early 1940 at the St. John Dry Dock, launched on the 15th of May, 1941, and commissioned on the 30th of December, 1941. In August of 1942, under Lieutenant Commander Alan Easton, Sackville engaged 3 separate U-boats inside roughly 24 hours, and Easton was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for it. Damaged in September of 1943, Sackville was converted to a training and loop-laying vessel, and after the war she became an oceanographic research ship, holding that role until she was finally paid off in 1982, 37 years after the war ended. Ownership passed to the Canadian Naval Memorial Trust in 1983. In 1985 she was designated Canada's Naval Memorial, and in 1988 she was designated a National Historic Site. Sackville moors beside the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic in Halifax through the summer and winters in HMC Dockyard, kept alive by a refit funded up to $3.5 million in 2018 and a 3-month dry docking in 2024. On the 15th of May, 2026, exactly 85 years to the day after she was launched, HMCS Sackville was honorarily recommissioned into the Royal Canadian Navy. The chair of the Canadian Naval Memorial Trust, Lieutenant Commander Greg Cottingham, retired, described the meaning of that ceremony directly, saying that after 85 years the Royal Canadian Navy still considers Sackville one of their own. She still hosts committals of ashes at sea during the Battle of the Atlantic commemorations, which Canada marks on the first Sunday in May, and the 80th anniversary was observed in 2025. The last corvette still takes Canadian sailors out to the water for the last time. Now the arithmetic this whole account has been building toward. The Royal Canadian Navy today carries an official strength of 8,400 regular force sailors, 4,100 reservists, and 25 commissioned warships. 25 ships, against a service that in 1945 fielded between 370 and 434 warships and roughly 95,000 people. The official numbers are the optimistic ones, and the Royal Canadian Navy's own commanders have been unusually blunt about that. In November of 2023, the commander of the Royal Canadian Navy, Vice Admiral Angus Topsy, reported that only 6,226 naval personnel could be considered effective strength. Topsy described the situation as a personnel crisis and stated that the service was running 20% short in trained effective strength. In late 2025, Angus Topsy said the personnel problem remained dire, and in early 2026 Rear Admiral David Patchell reported the Navy was short roughly 2,000 personnel, or approximately 1/4 of its authorized strength. In early 2024, 54% of the Royal Canadian Navy's frigates, submarines, Arctic and offshore patrol ships, and maritime coastal defense vessels were reported unserviceable. 54% means more than half the fleet was not fit to sail. The fleet itself consists of 12 Halifax-class frigates, in service since the 1990s, 4 Victoria-class submarines, the remaining Kingston-class vessels retiring from late 2025, 5 to 6 Harry de Wolfe-class Arctic and offshore patrol ships, and 1 lease support ship. The replacement program is the River-class destroyer, formerly called the Canadian Surface Combatant, running to as many as 15 ships. The initial estimate under the National Shipbuilding Strategy in 2010 came to $26 billion, and the Parliamentary Budget Officer now estimates roughly $80 billion, with the 2021 and 2022 assessments ranging from $77.3 to $82.1 billion depending on delays. The first ship is not expected to be operational until the 2030s. The planned Continental Defense Corvette program, running to 16 or 20 ships, is not expected to see contracts awarded until 2030, with the first ship operational by 2039. Canada built a corvette in 10 months, in 1941, for $600,000, in a country that had 4 shipyards and had never built a warship fleet in its life. Canada's next corvette program expects to award contracts in 2030 and have the first hull at sea in 2039. 9 years to award the contract, 19 years to the first ship. In 1939, Canada did the entire Navy in 6. On the Todd Lindbergh scale, which ranks the world's navies by capability, the Royal Canadian Navy was classified as Rank 3, a multi-regional power projection navy, in 2005. By 2015 it had been reclassified to Rank 5, an offshore regional coastal defense navy. The Navy, once called the 3rd largest in the world, now struggles to crew and maintain 25 ships. The Royal Canadian Navy grew from 13 ships and 3,500 men in September of 1939 to somewhere between 370 and 434 warships and 95,000 sailors by 1945. Canada built that fleet out of an industrial base of 4 shipyards and fewer than 4,000 shipbuilders, in a country whose entire ocean-going merchant fleet numbered 38 vessels when the war began. That fleet was the 3rd largest in the world, or the 4th. Canada's own official sources cannot agree, and no metric settles the question, because largest navy was never a defined term. Count hulls and Canada finishes 3rd. Count capital ships and Canada has none. The expansion that produced the fleet also produced the crisis. Ships went to sea without gyrocompasses and without modern radar, making 16 knots, unable to catch a surfaced submarine, crewed by men who had not been sailors 2 years earlier. In the winter of 1942, the Royal Canadian Navy achieved a single unshared submarine kill, and in early 1943 the Royal Navy removed Canada's escort groups from the mid-ocean because they were not good enough. Mark Milner documented that failure, and the failure is real. Robert Fisher argues the failure was one of procurement and convoy assignment rather than of Canadian seamanship, and that argument is real as well. The two are not reconciled, and this account does not reconcile them. Vice Admiral Percy Nels built the fleet and was removed for building it too fast. Rear Admiral Leonard Murray commanded the only Allied theater ever entrusted to a Canadian and was destroyed by a 2-day riot. He was refused the chance to answer for. 8 of the roughly 22 principal warships Canada lost went down to accident and collision rather than to the enemy. 1,451 Canadian merchant sailors died, and Canada did not call them veterans until 1992. 25,343 merchant crossings arrived. 165 million tons of cargo were delivered. Britain was fed, the invasion was supplied, approximately 2,000 Royal Canadian Navy personnel died, and the fullest official count reaches 2,210, including 6 women of the Women's Royal Canadian Naval Service. HMCS Sackville is still afloat in Halifax, the last of the 269 to 294 Flower-class corvettes ever built. The Navy she belongs to now has 25 ships and cannot crew them, and expects its next corvette to reach the water in 2039. Canada proved, once, that it could build a navy in 6 years. Canada has never disputed the claim since. Canada has simply stopped doing it.